We won't sell. Leave our homes alone!
This is completely unacceptable.
There's a moment, and if you've ever been in a real legal or property dispute, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a moment where the other side realizes they've made a catastrophic mistake. Not a small one, not a procedural error they can walk back with a phone call. A foundational one, the kind where you watch the color drain from someone's face in real time, where their attorney leans over and starts whispering urgently, where the room goes completely silent because even the people who don't fully understand what just happened can feel the weight of it. I've seen that moment. I caused that moment. And it started not in a courtroom, not in a lawyer's office, not even in an HOA meeting. It started with a piece of land that nobody thought was worth anything, a piece of land that nobody bothered to verify, a piece of land that I bought legally, recorded properly, and held quietly for almost 2 years before a homeowners association decided I was the problem. Here's what I want you to understand before we get into any of this. I didn't set out to destroy anyone. I didn't buy that land as a trap. I didn't engineer this situation from the beginning hoping someone would step on the wire. But when they did, I was ready. And that's the story I'm going to tell you today. Stay with me, because the part that matters most doesn't come until the very end, and trust me, you'll want to be there for it. Let me tell you who I am, because context matters here. My name isn't important for this story. What is important is what I do for a living, because it's directly relevant to how this played out. I'm a civil engineer. I've been licensed for just over 19 years. I spent the first decade of my career working for a mid-sized municipal government, which means I spent 10 years reading surveys, reviewing plat maps, approving drainage easements, and sitting in rooms where people argued about property lines, access rights, and infrastructure. I understand how land is recorded, how it's transferred, and how the legal descriptions in deeds translate to actual physical space on the ground. That background matters. After leaving municipal work, I transitioned into private consulting. I work primarily on residential and light commercial development, site assessments, drainage analysis, access planning. That part of my work also matters, though you won't understand exactly why for a few more minutes. About 7 years ago, my wife and I decided we were done with city life. We had 2 kids, a third on the way, and a growing sense that the neighborhood we were in, nice as it was, didn't have the kind of space we actually wanted. Not just for us, but for the kind of life we were trying to build. We wanted land, real land. Not a quarter-acre lot with a privacy fence, but actual acreage where the kids could grow up doing things outside, where we could have some animals, a garden, some room to breathe. We started looking about 40 miles east of the city where we'd been living. That corridor had been semi-rural for decades, but was slowly seeing development pressure. Land was still relatively affordable if you knew where to look, and because of my professional background, I had a much clearer picture than most buyers of what made a particular parcel valuable versus what made it a problem. That's how I found the property I'll call Ridgeline. Ridgeline was a parcel of approximately 62 acres located in a semi-rural county. I'm deliberately being vague on location to protect the privacy of everyone involved, including myself. The parcel had been in the same family for generations and had recently come available through an estate sale. The asking price reflected the fact that most buyers looked at it and saw problems. Uneven terrain, a seasonal drainage feature running through the middle, no existing structures, and an oddly shaped legal description that made it hard to visualize without really sitting down with the survey. I'm exactly the kind of person who looks at those things and sees opportunity rather than obstacle. I drove out 3 times before making an offer. I walked the boundaries with a GPS unit. I pulled the county assessor records, the historic aerial imagery, the drainage basin maps. I located every recorded easement, every access grant, every deed restriction attached to that parcel and its neighbors going back to the original county plats from the 1940s. That last part is where things got interesting, but I'm not going to tell you that part yet. We purchased Ridgeline 14 months after we first looked at it. We built a home, a modest one, practical, designed for the land rather than designed to impress anyone, and we moved in about 9 months after that. At that point, we had been living there for just over a year before any of this began. The kids were thriving. My wife had started a small operation with some heritage breed chickens and a kitchen garden that had turned into something genuinely impressive. I had built a workshop where I could do design work from home and also get my hands on actual materials, which is something I'd missed when I was in the office full time. Life was quiet, productive, exactly what we'd wanted. And then, about 11 months into living there, I had a reason to pull out one of those old survey documents again. Not because of anything threatening, not because anyone had said anything to me. I pulled it out because I was trying to solve a completely unrelated drainage issue on a section of the property and I needed to verify a historical flow path. That's when I saw it. The thing I had noticed during my original due diligence but hadn't fully processed until I was staring at it again with fresh eyes. Let me explain what it was. About a mile from our property boundary, to the southeast, there was a residential subdivision. It wasn't particularly large, maybe 140 homes, maybe 150 at the most. It had been developed in the late 1980s during a period when a lot of this semi-rural corridor was getting subdivided. It had a name, a homeowners association, and by all appearances, it was a perfectly ordinary suburban neighborhood that had simply been placed in a rural county because land was cheap out there 35 years ago. I knew it existed. I'd driven past the entrance a few times. I had no connection to it and no reason to think about it, but when I was looking at those county plat maps during my drainage research, I noticed something. Or rather, I noticed the absence of something. The subdivision, let's call it Millbrook Estates, sat in a natural valley. The terrain around it rises fairly steeply on three sides. The road into Millbrook ran along the floor of that valley, coming in from the main county road, passing through what appeared to be a narrow corridor of land and then opening up into the subdivision itself. That narrow corridor. That was what I kept coming back to. I went back to the original plat records. I found the survey from when Millbrook was developed. I found the deed from when the developer purchased the land for the subdivision in 1987. And then I went further back to the parcels that had existed before any of that development. And I traced the ownership of every piece of ground in that area going back to the original township survey. Here is what I found. The narrow corridor, the single piece of land that the road into Millbrook passed through, had been owned by the same family that owned the larger parcel to the north. When the subdivision developer came in and bought the land for Millbrook, they purchased the interior lots of the valley. But the corridor, the approximately 400-foot wide strip of land connecting the subdivision to the county road, they hadn't purchased outright. Instead, they had recorded an access easement. An easement is not the same as ownership. An easement gives you the right to use someone else's land for a specific purpose. In this case, the easement gave the subdivision the right to use that corridor for road access. The land itself remained privately owned. The family that owned the land to the north, the same family that had owned a large portion of this entire area for generations, retained ownership of the corridor under that easement. When I purchased Ridgeline, I purchased the 62-acre main parcel, a smaller adjacent parcel to the north that had been a separate tax lot, and, this is the part that matters, a third parcel that I had listed in my purchase as a residual lot in the transaction. That residual lot was the corridor. I want to be very precise here because precision is important. I did not purchase this secretly. I did not do anything clever or underhanded. The parcel was listed in the estate sale. It had a parcel number. It had a tax ID. It had been assessed for property taxes every year. It was recorded at the county recorder's office with a clear legal description. Nobody hid it. Nobody needed to, because nobody involved in Millbrook Estates, not the current HOA board, not any of the residents, apparently not even their own legal counsel, had ever gone back and verified who actually owned the land their road ran through. They had been operating on the assumption that the original access easement granted to the developer had somehow transferred into permanent, unencumbered ownership when the HOA was formed. It had not. I held the deed to that corridor, which meant I was the fee owner of the land through which the only road into Millbrook Estates passed. Now, at this point in the story, a lot of people would ask, so, what did you do with that information? And the answer, for a long time, was nothing. I noted it. I documented it carefully. I had a conversation with a property attorney who confirmed my interpretation of the title chain. And then I went back to my workshop and my drainage project and my kids and my wife's chickens, and I didn't think about it again for several months because I had nothing against the people in Millbrook Estates. I had no conflict with them. I had no reason to cause trouble for anyone. That changed when they came to me. I got a letter in the spring of my second year on the property. It was on HOA stationery, the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association, with their logo at the top and a formatting that was clearly meant to communicate seriousness. It was signed by the HOA board president. I'll call him Gerald. Gerald was, by all accounts, a man who had inhabited the role of HOA president for long enough that he had stopped distinguishing between the position and himself. He had been on the board for 11 years. He had been president for 7 of those. He ran the annual meeting with a printed agenda and a timer. He had, according to several Millbrook residents, who eventually told me their stories, once fined a homeowner for a wind chime. The letter informed me that my property, specifically the corridor parcel, was affecting the aesthetics and maintenance standards of the Millbrook community. It stated that I had neglected to maintain the landscape on the corridor to HOA standards. HOA standards. For land I owned that was not part of the HOA, had never been part of the HOA, and that no one in the HOA had apparently ever looked at closely enough to realize they didn't own. The letter closed with the following sentence, and I want to read it to you carefully because it tells you almost everything you need to know about what was coming. As the HOA holds responsibility for all common areas and access infrastructure within the Millbrook Estates community boundary, please be advised that failure to comply may result in the HOA exercising its maintenance authority over the area in question. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I put the letter in a manila folder, labeled it, and placed it in my filing cabinet. I did not respond. A second letter came 6 weeks later. This one was more pointed. It referenced a specific section of the Millbrook CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern the HOA, that described the board's authority over common areas. It made no mention of ownership. It made no mention of the deed. It simply asserted authority and demanded compliance. I put that letter in the same manila folder. 3 weeks after the second letter, Gerald showed up at my property in person. He came with another board member, I'll call her Patricia, who appeared to serve primarily as an audience for Gerald's authority. She took notes on a clipboard. Gerald was polite in that specific way that some people are polite when they are absolutely certain they have more power than you and want you to understand that while pretending otherwise. He explained the HOA's position. He said the corridor was technically in a gray area, but that the HOA had always treated it as their responsibility. He used the phrase community standards 4 times in approximately 12 minutes. He told me that the previous property owners had always cooperated with the HOA. I asked him one question. Do you have documentation of that cooperation? Anything in writing? He said the previous owners had simply understood how things worked. I thanked him for coming by, told him I'd look into the matter, and watched him drive away with Patricia and her clipboard. Then I called my attorney. Here's the thing about situations like this that most people get wrong. The instinct when someone comes at you with unwarranted authority and false confidence is to correct them immediately, to show your cards, to say, actually, here's the deed, here's the title, here's the legal description. This is mine, and you have no authority here. That instinct is understandable. It's also almost always the wrong move. When you correct someone too early, you give them time to adapt. You give their attorney time to build a counter-narrative. You give them the opportunity to go find evidence that supports their position before you've fully assembled yours. You turn what should be an overwhelming, decisive moment into a prolonged argument. I had spent 19 years in civil engineering and municipal government. I had sat in rooms where people were wrong, where organizations were wrong, where documents contradicted confident assertions, and I had watched what happened when those contradictions came out early versus when they came out at exactly the right moment. Patience, I had learned, is not passive. Patience, when applied strategically, is the most aggressive tool available. So I said nothing publicly. I made no assertions to Gerald or the HOA board. I did not respond to their letters beyond a single, brief acknowledgement that I had received them and would be reviewing the matter. Instead, I got to work. My first call was to my property attorney, I'll call her Margaret, who had handled my original purchase and was already familiar with the title history. I had a 2-hour meeting with her where we went through every relevant document, the original plat, the easement language from 1987, the deed chain on the corridor parcel, and the HOA's own governing documents. Margaret confirmed what I had already concluded. I held fee simple ownership of the corridor. The easement granted to the subdivision gave Millbrook residents the right to use the road for access, but it did not give the HOA ownership, maintenance authority, or enforcement jurisdiction over the land itself. She also noted something I hadn't fully examined yet. The easement language from 1987 was tied to the original developer, not the HOA. When the HOA was formed and the developer stepped back, nobody had legally transferred the easement rights or executed a proper access agreement with whoever now owned the underlying land. In other words, the legal instrument that gave Millbrook residents their road access was potentially more fragile than anyone had ever examined. I did not intend to threaten their access. That was not my goal. But understanding the full picture of my legal position was essential. My second call was to a title company, different from the one I'd used for my own purchase, and I ordered a title search on the corridor parcel going back to its original recording. This would take several weeks, but would give me an independent, professional confirmation of the ownership chain. My third step was physical documentation. I hired a licensed land surveyor to walk the boundary of the corridor parcel and produce a stamped survey showing the precise legal limits of my ownership relative to the road, the utility lines, and the Millbrook subdivision entrance. This would eliminate any ambiguity about exactly what land was mine and where the lines fell. While all of this was in progress, Gerald sent a third letter. This one was different. This one mentioned for the first time the possibility of legal action. The third letter was written with what I recognized as the particular energy of someone who has just spoken to a lawyer for the first time and has come away with a very incomplete understanding of what that lawyer actually told them. It cited state statutes. It used legal terminology in ways that were adjacent to correct but not quite accurate. It referenced the HOA's established and continuous use of the corridor as a basis for a potential adverse possession claim, which suggested that whoever Gerald had spoken to had raised that as a theoretical possibility, and Gerald had interpreted it as a certainty. Adverse possession, for those unfamiliar, is a legal doctrine that allows someone to potentially claim ownership of land they don't hold title to if they've occupied and used it openly, continuously, and exclusively for a statutory period, which in this state was 15 years, with additional requirements for payment of property taxes. The HOA had not paid the property taxes on the corridor. I had, as had the estate before me. The corridor had not been used exclusively by Millbrook. It was legally open to use by the underlying landowner, and the use had not been hostile or adverse. It had been under an easement, which actually defeats an adverse possession claim because using land under a permissive agreement means you're not claiming it adversely. I noted all of this. I put the third letter in the manila folder. And then the situation changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. About 3 weeks after the third letter, I started hearing from residents of Millbrook Estates directly, not from the board, from individual homeowners. It turned out that Gerald had convened a special board meeting and had presented my situation to the community in a way that was, to put it charitably, not fully accurate. He had told residents that a neighboring property owner was attempting to block their access and threaten their road. He had framed it as an aggressive land grab on my part, which was the exact opposite of what had actually happened. He had also, and this I found out later, told several residents that the HOA's attorney had advised them they had a strong case for adverse possession. As a result, I started getting unpleasant interactions when I drove past the neighborhood entrance. I found that someone had placed a sign on a fence post near the corridor, not technically on my land, but close, that said something to the effect of "Private Road, Keep Out," with the Millbrook logo on it, which was factually backwards from the actual situation. My wife was approached at the small farm supply store about 15 miles away by a woman who identified herself as a Millbrook resident and said things that I will not repeat here but that were not kind. The social pressure campaign was underway. My children were not affected. They're young and don't move in those social circles. But I noticed, and my wife noticed, there's a version of this story where I get angry at that point, where I drive over to Gerald's house and have words with him, where the emotion of it, the unfairness, the misrepresentation, the decision to involve my family, pushes me into a reaction. I understood that impulse completely. I did not act on it, because I was almost ready. The title search came back first. Clean chain, exactly as I'd expected. The corridor parcel had been continuously owned by the same family from 1952 until the estate sale from which I purchased it. At no point had any portion of it transferred to the subdivision developer, the HOA, or any entity associated with Millbrook Estates. The easement from 1987 was clearly recorded as an easement, not a conveyance, not a transfer, not a right-of-way deed. Ownership of the underlying land had been mine since the day we closed. The survey came back 3 days later. My surveyor, a man I'd worked with professionally and trusted completely, produced a stamped document showing the precise boundaries of the corridor, the center line of the road, the approximate locations of the underground utilities, and the relationship of all of this to the recorded easement description and the HOA's own plat. The road sat almost entirely within my parcel. There was one corner, a very small section near the county road entrance, where the road's edge came close to the boundary of a separately recorded right-of-way that predated even the 1987 easement. But the overwhelming majority of the physical infrastructure sat on land I owned. My attorney and I met again. This time we also brought in a real estate litigation specialist she worked with. I'll call him David, who was experienced in easement disputes and HOA law. David reviewed everything and gave me his assessment over about 90 minutes. The HOA's adverse possession argument was essentially non-existent, for the reasons I'd already identified and several more he added. The easement was valid, but narrowly constructed. It permitted road access for residents of Millbrook Estates, but it did not grant the HOA any rights of maintenance, enforcement, or jurisdiction over the underlying land. The HOA had sent me letters asserting authority they simply did not have. David also flagged something that Margaret and I had discussed, but that he articulated more sharply by asserting that the corridor was HOA property and communicating that to their residents. Gerald had potentially made representations that were legally problematic. He had told homeowners something about property rights that wasn't true in a way that could expose the HOA board to liability. We discussed options. I want to be clear about what I decided and why. I was not interested in terminating the road access. 140-plus families lived in Millbrook. Their children went to school through that road. Emergency vehicles used it. Closing or restricting access would be legally complex, ethically questionable, and practically speaking, not something I had any desire to pursue. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the HOA to acknowledge the truth of who owned the land. I wanted them to stop asserting authority they didn't have. I wanted them to stop misrepresenting the situation to their residents. And I wanted a properly documented access agreement, not the 1987 easement left to drift without maintenance responsibility defined, but a current, legally sound document that clarified everyone's rights and responsibilities going forward. That was it. That was the whole goal. Gerald could have gotten there with a phone call at any point in the prior 5 months. Instead, he had chosen escalation. So we prepared for the meeting. David drafted a formal notice. Not a threat, not a demand for money, but a notice that I was the fee owner of the corridor parcel and that I was requesting the opportunity to address the HOA board and membership at their next scheduled meeting to discuss the situation directly. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in late October. I had 45 days to prepare. I used every one of them. The Millbrook Estates HOA held its monthly meetings in the community center near the entrance to the subdivision. A modest building, clean and well-kept, with folding tables arranged in rows and a small raised platform at the front where the board sat. I had never been inside it before that night. I arrived 11 minutes early. I wore what I wear to professional presentations, a plain button-down, dark trousers, nothing designed to impress, nothing designed to intimidate. I carried a leather portfolio and a cardboard presentation tube. The room was more crowded than a typical HOA meeting. Word had apparently gotten around that there was going to be a confrontation of some kind. I estimated between 80 and 90 homeowners in attendance, which represented something close to a majority of the Millbrook households. There were some faces in the crowd that showed suspicion when I walked in. There were others that showed curiosity. A few people nodded at me in a way that I interpreted as neutral acknowledgement. Gerald was already at the front table. He was in a polo shirt with the Millbrook Estates logo on the breast. He had a stack of papers in front of him and a look on his face that I recognized immediately. The look of a man who believes he is in control of a situation and is preparing to demonstrate that control publicly. Patricia was next to him with her clipboard. There were 2 other board members whose names I didn't know. In the back of the room, I noticed a man in a suit who I didn't recognize. He had the particular posture of someone who is there professionally but is trying not to appear conspicuous. I suspected, correctly, as it turned out, that he was the HOA's attorney. I took a seat in the front row. I placed my portfolio on my knee and the presentation tube against the wall beside me. I did not look at Gerald. I did not look at the attorney in the back. I looked at the agenda posted on a small easel to the right of the platform, which listed my item as the third item of business, after treasurer's report and new landscaping quotes. The meeting opened at 7 o'clock exactly. I will spare you the treasurer's report and the landscaping discussion, except to note that the room was tense in a way that those agenda items did nothing to relieve. There was a quality of anticipation in the air that you can feel but not describe precisely, the collective awareness of a community that something significant is about to happen. When Gerald finally called my item, he did so in a voice that was controlled and deliberate. He described me as a neighboring property owner with concerns about a boundary matter and explained that the board had agreed to allow a brief presentation. He used the word allow. I noted that. I stood, thanked him and the board for the time, and I began. I started with a question. Before I present anything tonight, I want to ask the board a simple question, and I'd like the answer on the record. Does the HOA hold a deed or title to the corridor parcel, the approximately 4 acres of land through which your entrance road passes? Silence. Gerald looked at his papers. He looked at Patricia. He said with full confidence, "The corridor is part of the HOA's common area access infrastructure. The board has maintained it as such since the community's founding." I said, "That's not what I asked. My question was whether the HOA holds a deed or title to that parcel." More silence. The attorney in the back shifted in his seat. Gerald said, "The HOA has established access rights under the original development easement." "Thank you," I said. "That's actually a very important distinction, and I want to come back to it." I opened my portfolio and removed the first document. "This," I said, holding it up so the room could see, "is a copy of the county assessor's parcel record for the corridor, parcel number 047-211-0034. I want to read you 2 specific lines from this record." I paused. In situations like this, pauses are not theatrical. They're functional. They give people time to understand what they're hearing before you add the next piece. You never want the audience ahead of you or behind you. You want them exactly with you, processing each layer as you lay it down. "Owner of record," I read. "My name, acquisition date, the date I purchased it." I set the assessor record on the table in front of the board. "This parcel has been on the county tax rolls continuously since 1952. It has never been owned by the Millbrook Estates developer, the Millbrook Estates HOA, or any entity associated with Millbrook Estates. I purchased it as part of an estate sale, properly recorded, properly transferred. I have paid property taxes on it every year since I acquired it." The room was very quiet. I removed the second document, the title search. "This is an independent title search conducted by a licensed title company covering the full ownership history of the corridor parcel from its original recording to the present date. It confirms an unbroken chain of private ownership. It contains no deed transfer to any HOA or developer." I set it on the table. "This is the original 1987 easement document," I said, removing the third item, "recorded when the subdivision was developed. I want to read you the critical language." I found the paragraph and read it aloud. "The easement granted access for ingress and egress by residents of the Millbrook Estate subdivision over a described strip of land. It made no mention of maintenance authority, enforcement authority, or ownership transfer. It did not name the HOA. It was granted to the developer and its successors in interest." Language that was itself ambiguous in its application to an HOA formed after the developer's exit. "This easement," I said, "gives you the right to use this road for access. That right is real. That right is valid. No one in this room is disputing it tonight." I looked directly at Gerald for the first time. "What it does not give you is ownership of the land. It does not give the HOA maintenance authority over that land. It does not give the HOA enforcement jurisdiction over that land. And it certainly does not give the HOA the right to send a neighboring landowner letters asserting authority over land they do not own." Gerald straightened. "The HOA has maintained that corridor for decades." "I know," I said. I kept my voice completely level. "And I want to address that directly, because it's important." I removed the fourth document, my surveyor's stamped plat. "This is a current survey of the corridor parcel, produced by a licensed land surveyor, showing the precise boundaries of the parcel relative to the physical road, the utility corridors, and the entrance infrastructure. I unrolled it and clipped it to the small presentation board I had set up before the meeting started. I watched people in the first few rows lean forward to see it. What you can see here, I said, indicating the survey, is that the physical roadway sits within the bounds of this parcel. The maintenance the HOA has performed on this road, the paving, the striping, the drainage work near the entrance, has been performed on land owned by a private party, not the HOA. I let that sit for a moment. Now, that maintenance has been performed under the reasonable but mistaken belief that the HOA owned this land. No one is being accused of bad faith for performing maintenance, but the legal reality is that maintenance of land does not establish ownership, and maintenance of land subject to an easement does not create adverse possession rights. I paused again. I know the HOA has received legal advice suggesting adverse possession may be a viable theory here. I want to address that now. From the back of the room, I saw the attorney sit up straighter. Adverse possession in this state requires open, continuous, exclusive, hostile, and actual possession for 15 years, combined with payment of property taxes for 5 of those years. I want to walk through each element. I did, methodically. I had prepared this section carefully, and I delivered it the way I would deliver a technical finding to a municipal planning board. Clearly, without condescension, without drama, fact by fact, open and continuous, potentially arguable, given the maintenance history. Exclusive, not met. The easement gave multiple parties rights to use the land, and the underlying owner, the estate before me, had never been excluded. Hostile, not met. Use under an easement is permissive, and permissive use defeats hostile possession as a matter of established law. I cited the relevant state case. Property taxes, not met. County records showed the property taxes had been paid by the private owner, the estate before me, and now me, every year without exception. The HOA had never paid them. In order for the adverse possession claim to succeed, I said, a court would need to find that multiple elements were satisfied simultaneously. The most straightforward disqualifying factor is the property taxes. The HOA has not paid them. I have documentation of every payment going back 19 years. I set the tax payment records on the table. The room was deeply quiet now, not the anticipatory quiet of before the meeting, a different kind of quiet. The quiet of a large group of people simultaneously updating their understanding of a situation they had been told was one thing and were now discovering was another. Gerald spoke. His voice had changed slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there before. The board has operated in good faith based on the information available to us, he said. We have always believed. I understand, I said, and I'm not here to assign blame for the misunderstanding of ownership. What I am here to address is what happened after the misunderstanding was pointed out. I opened to a specific page in my portfolio. This is your first letter to me, dated March 14th. In this letter, the board claimed it had maintenance authority over the corridor and threatened to exercise that authority unilaterally. I read the sentence aloud, the sentence I mentioned at the beginning. At the time this letter was sent, had the board verified who held the deed to the corridor parcel? Silence. Had anyone reviewed the title chain before asserting this authority in writing? More silence. Had anyone checked the county assessor records, which are publicly available at no cost, before claiming authority over this land? Gerald said. The board believed. I know what the board believed, I said quietly. My question is what the board verified. That was the moment. That was the one I mentioned at the beginning of this story. The moment where the color changes, where the confidence recalibrates, where a person who has been operating on unverified assumptions encounters someone who has verified everything. I wasn't done. I want to show you one more document, I said. I reached into the portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper, not a legal document, not a survey, a photograph, a printout of a photograph taken from the County Historical Archive. This is an aerial photograph of this area taken in 1971, approximately 16 years before the Millbrook subdivision was developed. I want you to look at what you see in the corridor. I clipped it to the presentation board next to the survey. The photograph showed the terrain clearly, the valley, the natural topography, and the narrow corridor strip, and running along the corridor, visibly distinct from the surrounding vegetation, what appeared to be a fence line. This fence, I said, appears in aerial photography from 1971, 1978, and 1984. It is documented in the original estate records as the western boundary marker of the parcel. It predates the subdivision. It predates the easement. It establishes that this land was actively maintained as a distinct private parcel for decades before Millbrook Estates ever existed. I let that land. Now, and this is why this matters. When the 1987 easement was drafted, the developer's attorney presumably saw this fence. The surveyor presumably noted the parcel boundary. The easement was written with knowledge that this was someone else's land. They chose to draft an easement rather than purchase the land outright. That was a deliberate legal choice. I turned to face the room more fully, which means the HOA was founded on a document that assumed this land was privately owned. The access rights of every homeowner in this room were established through a document that acknowledged private ownership of the corridor. The HOA's own governing documents, if you trace them back to their origin, rest on a foundation that contradicts everything the board has been telling you about this situation. I watched several homeowners turn to look at each other. One woman in the third row, older, silver-haired, with the composed expression of someone who has been paying close attention, raised her hand. I acknowledged her. "So our access rights are based on an easement," she said, "not ownership." "Correct. And the easement is still valid?" "The easement is valid," I said. "I am not disputing or threatening your access rights. The road exists, it will continue to exist, and no one is going to be prevented from driving in or out of their homes." She nodded, slowly. "Then, what's the actual problem?" she asked. "The problem," I said, "is that the board sent letters asserting authority over land they don't own, threatened legal action based on a claim that has no foundation, misrepresented the situation to this community in a way that created unnecessary fear and conflict, and declined every opportunity to simply verify the facts before escalating." Another homeowner, a man in his 50s near the back, said, "Why didn't you just tell Gerald the deed information when he first contacted you?" Fair question. I'd expected it. Because the question of who owns the land and what authority the HOA has over it is not a question I should have to answer. The board has a legal obligation to verify its own authority before asserting it. That's not my responsibility. It's theirs. And more importantly, if I had simply told Gerald in the first letter that I held the deed, I'd have no way of knowing whether this would just happen again with the next property, the next dispute, the next opportunity to assert authority over something the board hadn't actually verified. I paused. Patterns like this don't end with one correction. They end when there are consequences for acting without verification. The attorney in the back was now leaning forward, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. Gerald had stopped writing on his notepad. "What I'm proposing tonight," I said, "is straightforward. I am willing to execute a formal, properly documented access easement or access license agreement, depending on what your attorney recommends, that clearly and permanently establishes Millbrook residents' access rights over the corridor. This document will be properly recorded with the county, properly referenced in the HOA's governing documents, and properly maintained going forward. In exchange, I ask that the board formally acknowledge, in writing, that the corridor is not HOA property, and that the board had no authority over it, and that the board retract and correct the statements made to homeowners characterizing this situation as an external threat to their access. We can negotiate reasonable terms for maintenance responsibility. My preference is a shared maintenance protocol with defined responsibilities. I maintain the underlying property. The HOA maintains the road surface under the easement rights, as they've been doing, just with proper legal documentation this time. That's all I'm asking for. Not compensation, not litigation, not anything dramatic. Just an accurate legal record and an honest communication to your community. I sat down. The meeting ran for another 2 hours after my presentation. Gerald attempted twice to reframe the situation as a negotiation where the HOA had legitimate leverage. Both attempts faltered against the documents on the table. The second attempt was gently but firmly interrupted by the HOA's own attorney, who asked to speak to the board privately for 15 minutes. During that recess, I sat in my chair and did not talk to anyone. Several homeowners approached me with questions, and I answered them honestly and without embellishment. When the board reconvened, the attorney spoke briefly. He acknowledged, carefully, lawyer carefully, that the title history was as I had presented it. He recommended that the board not pursue adverse possession litigation given the property tax history and the easement's permissive nature. He suggested that the proposed access agreement was a reasonable path to resolution. Gerald said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I think we need to take a vote on whether to pursue the proposed agreement." The vote was unanimous, 4-1. Gerald was the one. Over the following 6 weeks, my attorney and the HOA's attorney negotiated a formal access license agreement. It established a permanent access right for Millbrook residents over the corridor, clearly defined my ownership of the underlying land, specified maintenance responsibilities on both sides, and included an annual review clause so that maintenance needs could be addressed as they arose. The agreement was executed, signed by both parties, and recorded with the county. The HOA also sent a letter to all homeowners. It corrected the earlier characterization of the situation. It did not use the phrase "we were wrong." Attorneys rarely allow that. But it was clear enough that anyone reading it would understand what had happened. Gerald resigned from the board 2 months later, citing personal reasons. I heard from someone who knew someone on the board that there had been a number of difficult conversations about how the situation had been handled. I don't know the details. I didn't pursue them. It wasn't my concern. It's been 4 years since that meeting. The road is still there. People drive in and out of Millbrook Estates every day. Their kids get on the school bus at the end of that road. Delivery trucks come and go. Emergency vehicles have never been impeded. Nothing about the physical reality of Millbrook Estates changed. What changed was the documentation, the legal record, the clarity. On my side of things, my family never had another interaction with HOA representatives that wasn't civil and professional. We've occasionally communicated about the annual maintenance review. Those conversations have been brief, businesslike, and entirely unremarkable. My wife and I have added significantly to the property over the past 4 years. The kids have grown up in the way that kids grow up when they have room to do it. The workshop has been expanded twice. The chickens became a genuine small enterprise that my wife manages with a seriousness that I find genuinely impressive. The corridor parcel is, in the scheme of things, a small piece of our overall land. It matters less to our daily life than almost any other part of the property, but it mattered in that room. On that Tuesday night in October, it mattered because someone had decided that authority could substitute for accuracy, that confidence was equivalent to correctness, that a long enough assertion, repeated firmly enough, would eventually become fact. Those decisions have consequences. I want to tell you one more thing about that meeting because I've thought about it a lot in the years since. When I was driving home that night, I passed the Millbrook entrance. The lights were still on in the community center. I could see a few cars still in the parking lot. I thought about the people in that room, not Gerald, not the board, but the actual homeowners who had come in that night carrying a fear they'd been handed by someone they trusted. The fear that their road was in danger, that some stranger with a deed was going to upend their lives. That fear was manufactured. It was created by someone asserting authority without verification and then, when challenged, doubling down rather than checking his work. Those homeowners didn't deserve that. I don't carry any particular satisfaction about what happened to Gerald professionally or personally. What I carry is the recognition that the thing I actually did was give 140 families a legal record that accurately describes their access rights, something they should have had from the beginning, something the system should have ensured they had. I just happened to be the one who made it happen. Here's what I want to leave you with. In property disputes, in most disputes, honestly, the side that wins is almost never the side that's loudest, most aggressive, or most confident. It's the side that's most accurate. Accuracy, in a legal context, is built from documents, from records, from verified facts, from the patient, unglamorous work of pulling original surveys and title chains and historical photographs and tax payment records and reading them carefully until you understand exactly what the situation actually is, as opposed to what everyone has assumed it to be. Gerald was confident. Gerald had been running that HOA for 7 years with barely any pushback. He had developed the reasonable but dangerous belief that confidence plus authority equals correctness. He had never encountered a situation where someone had done more homework than he had. The lesson is not that Gerald was a bad person. I genuinely don't believe he was. He was a person who had operated in an environment that had never required him to verify his assumptions, and he made a significant error when that environment changed. The lesson, and this is the one I keep coming back to, is that authority that isn't rooted in fact is incredibly brittle. It can look unbreakable for a very long time. It can look like it doesn't need to be tested. It can assert itself with complete conviction and face no challenge for years or decades. But when the challenge finally comes, when someone walks into the room with the actual documents, it doesn't erode gradually. It collapses completely. And the thing about that collapse is that it's quiet. There's no dramatic explosion, no shouting, no triumphant speech. There's just a folder full of paper and a room full of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. That's how it actually works. That's how it worked in my case. Patience, documentation, precision, not anger, not power, not money, just the actual facts, delivered at the right moment, in the right room, to the right audience. Facts don't need to be loud, they just need to be true. I'm going to leave this story here because I think it ends where it should. But before I go, I want to ask you something directly. If you've made it this far in this story, all the way to here, I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Not about Gerald, not about the HOA, about the strategy. Because there's a real question in this story that I think reasonable people can disagree on. When I received that first letter and realized immediately that I had a much stronger legal position than the HOA understood, should I have disclosed that immediately? Should I have sent Gerald a copy of the deed with the first reply and tried to resolve it quietly before it escalated, or was waiting? The right call? I have my answer. I've told you what it is. But I'm curious about yours. Leave it in the comments because I read them and I want to know specifically, would you have played it the same way or would you have moved earlier? And if you've ever had an HOA situation where someone tried to assert authority over something they didn't understand or something they didn't own, tell me about it. Those stories deserve to be told. One more thing. I have another story I've been thinking about sharing for a while, one that's a little different from this one. It involves a commercial property, a municipal code dispute, and an engineer who discovered that a city agency had been enforcing a regulation that had actually been repealed 11 years earlier. That one took 3 years to resolve. And the ending is different, not as clean, more complicated, in ways that I think are worth exploring. If that sounds like something you'd want to hear, you know what to do. I'll see you there.